Hi, this is Gary Audin. I'm bringing you an EDUcast, Communications Tax Compliance, how to get compliant and stay there. And today, our speakers are myself and Brent Reeves, Business Development for CCH SureTax, which is part of Wolters Kluwer. Welcome, Brent.
Thank you.
And who is Wolters Kluwer, Brent?
Wolters Kluwer is a global information company that provides software, research, and services to enterprise customers throughout the world. And CCH SureTax Communications is the flagship product as it relates to automation of communications taxes, fees, and surcharges.
Now, as we do in our usual EDUcast, we talk about what we're going to talk about. Now, we've got 5 pieces that we're going to discuss here. What is this all about? Communications tax. And you may not know what's going on out there. You see it on your bill all the time, but you're not sure what it is, who collects, and why. Why do you have to comply? What are the requirements there? There are 4 steps for going into communications tax compliance. But what if you're out of compliance? How do you return to that? And then finally, we're going to finish up with getting started, the 4 steps you need to be fully compliant. So let's start off on the first page of these slides. Communications tax facts are something that are kind of elusive. And the providers have to pay these taxes, collect these taxes. But what are these taxes all about?
Well, what these taxes are about are really the provider's obligation to the various state and local as well as federal agencies that govern communications revenues or tax on communications revenues, and that's everything from the FCC, which you probably obviously looked at your bill and seen things like the Federal Universal Service Fund charge, all the way down to state and local 911 fees and PUC fees and the like. And really, what we're trying to do is obviously just educate providers out there where their obligations lie to both collect and remit those obligations.
Now, as we look at this, one of the words that's going to pop up quite a bit here is the word compliance. Would you just address that for us?
Yeah, so compliance is just that. It's just abiding by the rules and regulations that are put forth in providing these communication services. And the reason why this is kind of a hot item is because the communication space as a provider is expanding greatly into companies that have not in the past been providers of these services as direct providers to the end user, to the end customer. In the past, in the old days, it was always like the AT&Ts of the world. But now, smaller MSPs, even mid-tier, hardware and computer-type companies are offering communication services. And many times they don't understand that the compliance or the obligations that they have are much different than just the traditional sales and use tax obligations that they may have had with their previous types of services.
Well, that gets into our next list, which is quite extensive, is who's required to comply? And it's much more than just the local telcos.
Yeah, absolutely. And this slide, I'm not going to obviously go through everything on this slide, but in a nutshell, if you are providing any type of communication service, so voice, data, potentially, not always, but potentially Internet of Things, video, streaming video, media. If you are providing those services to an end user on your invoice and you are who dictates the provision as well as the markup and invoicing of those services, then you are required to comply just as if you were an AT&T or a Verizon or someone of that nature.
Now, I, as an enterprise, would assume my provider takes care of this. Is that true?
In some cases, yes, but in most cases, no. And what we mean by that is many times these are resale type services. So, I'm an MSP. I'm providing network services to a lot of my businesses, and now I'm going in and I'm also providing them maybe data circuits or unified communications, and I'm billing those for those services. Well, I may be provisioning those services from an underlying tier 1, like again, I keep going back to AT&T, but any of the tier 1 carriers, level 3 or someone like that, and then I'm reselling those services to my customer. Well, my provider, my upstream provider, so my tier 1 carrier, if they don't have the correct exemption certificates on file for me as the provider to my end user, then they're automatically going to be charging me, kind of as the middleman, so to speak, the federal universal service funds, the taxes and things of that nature. That does not mean that your obligations are met appropriately, or that's more of a cover their butt, so to speak. It doesn't mean that they're really covering yours. So in some cases, it may be completely in line, and your interests may be completely in line. In many cases, they're not.
That gets into the next point, which is, what if I don't comply?
Well, that's a very broad topic, but immediately if you don't comply and you are audited, then you are at risk of being obligated for the taxes, fees, and penalties that you haven't collected. So those taxes and fees obviously could be substantial, and the penalties themselves can also be substantial. So if you are, again, providing those services and it's on your invoice and you're dictating the markup and the pricing to your customer, then you are obligated to pay those taxes, and if you're not in compliance, then you will be the one that is defending yourself again, either at an auditor's table or, hopefully not, but if it gets to the extent where it's a legal battle, then you're the one that's on the hook. So obviously penalties can be very steep, and we'll address that a little bit later.
I think there's something very important on this slide, and this will affect the value of your company. And does this mean that if I'm selling my company, I'm doing this, and I don't collect the taxes, it changes the value of my company?
Oh, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, we've been in situations where we have been brought into to companies that were going through that acquisition stage, and these unfunded tax liabilities became a very, very large hit to obviously the value of the company. So there were some significant set-asides that were put in place because of the unfunded tax liabilities. And of course, when you have unfunded tax liabilities, those are growing at an exponential rate, and they're obviously based on a percentage of your revenue. Well, oftentimes your business is being sold based on a multiple of either your revenue or your EBITDA. And, so very quickly, if you've been out of compliance for, 2, 3, 4 years, very quickly those amounts of unfunded tax liabilities can grow, in excess of a multiple of your EBITDA. So, that's obviously a very, very big impact if you are going to sell your business.
Let's move forward and then talk about how do we comply now.
Yeah, sure. So right here we have two main requirements. It expands beyond that, and we'll talk about it a little bit more as we move forward. But the biggest two, if you will, is, first of all, being registered appropriately. So some people use the word licensing. That's not necessarily factually correct, although in some states and based on the types of services you are providing, it could be licenses like a CLEC license or something of that nature. But many times it's just registering properly with the authority. So that's federal, state, and local jurisdictions. And then, of course, reporting and remitting the taxes and fees that you collect. So as the money comes in, you need to properly remit that in a timely basis to those same authorities.
There are 4 steps we're going to talk about in more detail, but would you briefly go through those before we go through the details?
Yeah, sure. So if you are providing these services, then really there's kind of 4 main steps. Obviously registration, so what we just talked about, being legally authorized to provide these services in these states and jurisdictions and municipalities. And then tax calculation. So you're registered to do business, which allows you to charge appropriately your customers. But how do I know how much I'm supposed to charge? How do I know how a VoIP service is charged in Wyoming versus New York? How do I know what authorities I'm supposed to collect for? And that's where the tax calculation method goes in. So you have to understand, exactly based on the revenue and the service, how much for the various types of taxes and fees that you need to collect. Of course, billing. So you need to get that information onto your invoice so that you could collect the appropriate funds. And the last, again, reporting remittance. So now that you've collected the money or invoiced the money at least, you need to report the appropriate amounts to the tax authorities, and then obviously track that as you move forward.
That seems to define sort of a process here rather than something that's just trivially easy to do.
Yeah, it really is a process. So and as best as possible, you would obviously want to strive to automate that process. So, sans the registration process, everything else can be pretty much automated. So that includes, if you're using an appropriate billing engine, a BSS OSS solution that has, a telecom kind of centric architecture to where it can get, the information from your carrier, whether it be CDRs or data usage, so it can take that information and then properly create an invoice using your markup and your methodology to go out to your customer. So that process can usually be automated. So where you're getting the data from the carrier into the billing absolutely can be automated to the tax engine. So the tax engine then takes that same information and takes what is on the invoice, and then based on the location of the service and the various citing rules around the services and the revenue generated, it will place back on that invoice exactly the correct naming convention as well as the amounts of the taxes that need to be calculated. That information can obviously be routed to the appropriate GL accounts within your accounting system. And then once you've collected that money, or once you've at least invoiced that money, then that information can be automated from say a SureTax or a tax calculation engine over to a compliance group. Whether or not that's an in-house, then it can be just an automatic report that's generated that says, hey, customer AYZ, this is everything you sold, where you sold, and here's all the people you owe and how much money you owe them. Conversely, if you're using a third party, many of our partners have built automated processes for that too, where our reports will go directly to them, which will populate the returns that they have to fill out for you, and in which case they just then send you kind of a reconciliation and say, do you authorize me to pay these monies on your behalf? And in which case that, you sign off on that, the funds are then submitted to the escrow, and then all of those returns are filed on your behalf, and then of course a reconciliation from a reporting aspect will be sent back to you. So again, it is a process, but it can be a very automated process.
Now, the one point you made earlier is that you can't really automate the tax registration process, and you have to get that correct initially to move on to do everything else. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So the FCC, there are some kind of, I don't want to call them automated, but there are some, online ways that you can do that. I still would recommend that you at least consult a telecom-specific practice because there are some kind of, slip-ups you can make when filing those forms that could obligate you, especially if you're out of compliance and you're trying to get into compliance. There are definitely some kind of slip-ups that can occur that could cause you to be on the hook a little more than maybe you should if you had consulted with a professional. So if need be, we can obviously refer you to a firm that we partner with that does these types of things.
That first process, though, is like filing with the FCC. You can't avoid that at all, can you?
No, absolutely not. So that's an area where we do see a lot of mistakes. On a state-by-state basis, you're really registering as you have revenue to report. With the FCC, you're registering as soon as you want to offer services. So we do see that as a mistake often, where people will offer services, they won't register with the FCC. They say, you know what, we're small. Once we get bigger or we get out of what's called de minimis status, we'll register. That is absolutely incorrect. So if you are offering the services, you absolutely need to register with the FCC. It's really with USAC who manages the FCC, but for the purpose of this EDUcast, we'll just use the term FCC across the board. But yeah, absolutely. If you are going to provide services, whether you have $1 of sales, you need to register with the FCC.
Now, one of the things that I would get concerned about is how does the FCC deal with the enforcement here?
Well, enforcement of the FCC is based on the similar, I don't want to say similar tactics as you will, but as the IRS. So they have an auditing group which will audit you if once you've registered and you are remitting to them the payments. You are obviously subject to audit just like you would be if you are requiring when you're filing your income taxes. One thing I do want to mention, though, is, since you kind of brought that up, is not registering with the FCC does not make you immune to audit. So we do see that sometimes where people go, well, I'm kind of small. I really want to stay under the radar for now. I don't want to register with the FCC because then they know I'm here, and I'll deal with that once I have enough revenue. That's a very dangerous thought process. So the fact that you are registering does not make you a larger target for audit. And quite frankly, honestly, registering with the FCC is very inexpensive. And quite frankly, the compliance with the FCC regulations is also it's somewhat painless if you use the automated process, but it's also not real expensive. So kind of trying to hide, so to speak, is really a higher cost, not just the risk, but it's a higher cost than if you just complied from the beginning.
That means we need to get into the next question of what is tax calculation in this environment?
Yeah, so tax calculation is simply that. It is calculating how much you're supposed to collect and how much you're supposed to pay. So the way the process typically works, well, you've got a couple different methods. You could do it yourself, and you could research, all of the various taxes, fees, and surcharges, and try to apply those. Of course, there's a lot of logic that goes into the calculations that's beyond just a percentage. So that's obviously very difficult. If you're in one state, it's potentially doable. Beyond one state, it's vastly out. I think it's vastly outside the scope of a good expectation for any the majority of internal tax teams. So the way the process typically works is, okay, what are you selling? Send that information over to your tax engine. By the way, this is automated and usually done, via an API, but in a nutshell, it's, what did you sell, and then where did you sell, and how much did you sell it for? From that aspect, the tax engine will then take that information and say, okay, well, based on that fact pattern, that information, these 6 or 7 taxes apply, and here's how much you need to apply to each of these services, and again, put that directly onto an invoice.
What you're talking about is automating the process, and you use the term tax calculation engine. Would you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, so a tax calculation engine, as I mentioned, just kind of takes all that information and calculates the taxes for you, versus what I call, what is a data table, so to speak. So with communications, not only are there, thousands of different taxes, different rules that are applied, there's the logic behind the application is very, very confusing. So I can give you a rate of tables of rates, but if you don't know how to properly apply those with, understanding breakpoints, thresholds, tiers, tax on tax, and the other, regulatory impositions, all those types of things, and even registration profile, if you don't understand how those impact the tax, then really the rate isn't going to do anything for you. Quite frankly, it could cause you more harm than good. So a tax calculation engine takes that burden off of you. So what it does is says, okay, as opposed to you trying to understand, and manage and update rates every month, just tell me what you did, and we will tell you the information. All that logic is within the system. So you have, tax professionals who are constantly researching not only again the rates but the methodology and updating that within a system, and it's just automating that whole management and understanding process, if you will. So if there is breakpoints and thresholds and tiers and different citing rules that need to be applied based on the products or services in the various different states, the engine knows all of that. So the engine knows that, okay, a VoIP service in Georgia may be only exposed to 3 taxes, while that same service in New York, depending on the municipality in New York, could be 11 or 12 taxes. It knows that in New York there's an excise tax and a transportation tax and all those types of things. So that's kind of the difference.
What that gets into, and what you're telling me, is that somebody's got to bill for all of this, and if you don't do the billing properly, you don't get the tax payment back, and then you end up owing money. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So just because you didn't bill it correctly doesn't mean that you are not obligated for the correct tax, right? So the obligations are on you as the provider, not on your customer. Just because you didn't collect the right amount doesn't mean that you don't owe it. And even you could be doing what you think is right, but under audit, if it's deemed that you misapplied a tax, then you are obligated for the difference. Whether or not it be, if you're overtaxing, then you could be you could be exposed to fines and penalties for that, and of course rebating that tax to your customers, which could be slightly embarrassing. Or if you're undertaxing, then obviously that would have a negative impact on your customers, only to the sense that now you've got to notify them, hey, we have to increase what we've been charging you. We're sorry that your bill's going to go up. But also you are obligated for the delta to the taxing authority. Now
that you've billed all the stuff, and now don't you have to report and remit all of this? There's another process here as well.
Yeah, of course. So, that's simply just the back end of the entire process. So the most critical piece, quite frankly, is just getting the taxing right. If you've got the taxing right, you've got it on the invoice, and you're collecting the right amounts, then everything else is just process. So, you do have to obviously report and remit. Your Department of Revenue, depending on where you are and the states that you're in, they have certain filing frequencies, and the FCC has set filing frequency. So depending on your status with the FCC, your filing frequency could be annual, it could be quarterly, and there are a number of different reports that have to be filed at that level. CP&I and 499 and things of that nature. At the local, state and local levels, mostly the states and municipalities are usually monthly. Some of them could be quarterly, based on your exposure and your revenue amounts.
Now, what we said in the beginning here, we were going to talk about 4 steps of how to get started. Would you go through those 4 steps? And I noticed you talk about a people team first before you even get to the rest of it.
Yeah, well, absolutely, because, if you're venturing into this, if you're already there and you are listening to this EDUcast, then, chances are that you either feel or that maybe you're out of compliance. In which case, getting back into compliance, you need someone to advise you, right? You don't want to just go down the path and, assuming that, you can do it yourself. I would highly recommend that you put together a team. So that team is obviously your regulatory team. So, your team is going to advise you on your registrations, and if you have any VDA, voluntary disclosure that you need to do, how to do that appropriately. A team that's also involves the tax calculation engine, which is the area of calculating and remitting taxes. So the automated process. So that'll help you and guide you in implementing that engine. Billing, obviously, you want to incorporate a billing entity, a billing software provider, and the people who do that will also kind of advise you on the best ways to optimize what it is that you're doing in billing, and also optimize your profit capabilities. And then, of course, reporting. That's again, that has to happen at the end, and once again, they'll advise you on how to and where to and when to report to the various entities.
The last word you say on the screen is the word comply, but what if I'm not complying?
Well, if you're not compliant, that's obviously a problem. There are things like voluntary disclosures that you can do, and there are ways that you can address your past liabilities. The worst thing that you can do is just to continue to kick the can down the road and wait till you're audited. I highly recommend that if you're not in compliance, and even if you think you are in compliance, but you have a question about, maybe I'm not doing this right. This doesn't seem right. I would highly recommend that you, again, talk to a professional to evaluate your position and advise you on that. But if you're returning to compliance, the first thing to do is really reach out to a professional to get advice on what to do, as opposed to just kind of going, headstrong into trying to, quickly jump into compliance on your own.
Now, CCH SureTax has been in this business a while, but where do you fit into this whole environment?
Yeah, so where we are is the software side. So we are the research around all of the tax rates and rules as it relates to communication services anywhere in the country, as well as Canada. And I think today we also service about 130 international countries. But what we are is taking all of that data that I mentioned, all of that research, how is a product taxed, how, what taxes apply, how do I apply this tax, and put all of that into a consumable automated process, again, to where all you have to do is, set up within the system, feed the information in of what you sold, where you sold it, and your regulatory profile. And we will provide all of the communications, taxes, fees, and surcharges that are applicable. So where we really sit is kind of in the hub, though, if you will. If you kind of think of it, the hub of the wheel, the calculation and the information is really the most important piece. But we really kind of sit in the middle of the ecosystem in the sense that we have the partners that we utilize to do the registration piece. We have the partners that we utilize to do the filing piece as well. And then, of course, our team itself is made up of the largest tax research team in the industry. I think right now we have around 25 to 27 industry professionals. So these are CPAs and attorneys that are constantly updating our communications. And those numbers, by the way, are specific to the communications vertical. Worldwide, we have over 1,000 researchers. But for the communications vertical, we have a very large team that, again, updates our software with all the latest rates and rules as it relates to communication services. And as more communication services come out, which there's improvements every day. There's vast, it's a vastly rapidly advancing technology space. So there's new products and services, new ways of delivering old products and services every day, and all of those can impact tax. So that's what we do. We stay up to date with all of that and put it into an automated consumable format.
One of the nice things about this EDUcast, and you have heard of Brent speaking about all of this, you can contact him directly either by email or through a phone call. Well, thank you very much, Brent. I appreciate the time you spent with us.
No, thank you, and hope this has been helpful.